Let's go. Right. We're going to be talking about Remains and Ozymandias. Do you want to start?
Sure.
Let's go.
Okay, so I believe The Remains is the best poem in the anthology for a multitude of reasons. The main one is how it portrays PTSD. Now, PTSD, obviously in a power and conflict cluster, is going to come up a lot. But the way that PTSD is explored in the poem Remains, through this sort of, in this initially very one-dimensional story of a soldier just going about the daily routine, how that story then evolves and sort of festers and manifests in the soldier's mind, and how that explains his guilt and sort of shows his guilt. That's the method that Armitage employs to convey that idea, is what I think is so brilliant about the poem, and that's why I think it's the best poem in the anthology.
Okay.
So I think Ozymandias is the best poem because it
Okay.
subtly explores this universal dichotomy between perceived power and reality of powerful people, which still relates to today. And in fact, Shelley, at the time of writing, used the poem to represent George III and criticise his monarchy.
Okay. So you're saying it's more universal because that same theme, that same idea.
Yes, and it recurs throughout history. It's
Yeah.
not, even though this is about an Egyptian pharaoh, throughout history, there's very similar ideas coming up about leaders having an overinflated sense of their own power and believing that even time can't wane their power, when in fact that's not true. Time is far more powerful than that.
Okay. Great. That's interesting. Right. Back to Remains. Are there any specific points in the poem, like specific quotes or anything like that really draw you to it?
Well, initially ignoring the story in the first place, I think the most important bit of this poem is the comma in the line, end of story, comma, except not really. For me, that comma represents this turning point in the story, from when it goes to the physical story of him actually remembering the events just on the surface, remembering what he did, what happened before, what happened during, what happened after. It then shifts into this emotional story which dives a little bit deeper into his perception and sort of feelings of guilt and PTSD that still are a part of this soldier's life. This is also shown in the quotes, sleep and he's probably armed, possibly not, dream and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. Sleep and dream here are both at the beginning of the sentence, which for me really heightens this effect of this is inescapable. He can't get this thought out of his mind. He can't stop remembering this event that's happened to him, which is further shown later on in that stanza by "and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out." This, for me, is also fundamental to understanding the poem, in the sense that the soldier, he's gone home and he's turned to these vices in order to try and forget the experiences that he's had, even though he can't. And flush him out, it's militaristic language. It's got this cathartic double meaning, where he's trying to flush the images out of his mind, and maybe trying to flush the sort of drink and the drugs out of his system as well, trying to become cleaner again. And I think as well, it's the second to last stanza, the last three lines, if you listen to the dug in behind, not left for dead in some distant sun-stand, sand-smothered land. I said sun-stand, didn't I? If you listen, there are these 12 D sounds in the final three lines, which represents, earlier in the poem, there are 12 shots fired, he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. I think the little subtle intricacies like that, when exploring this guilt, further demonstrates how it's stayed with him even years after he's left, and that supports, for me, the belief that this is the best poem in the anthology.
Okay, so it's sort of like embedded in
it's embedded
the poem
in his mind.
In the same way that it's embedded in his mind.
As well, dug in behind enemy lines. That strengthens this point in the sense that the narrator's mind is a battlefield where, it's sort of mangled and twisted with all the guilt that's sort of infested his mind.
Okay.
And it's got this sort of it's another sort of dual meaning where dug in behind enemy lines, they were also in these sort of enemy lines just patrolling around when the actual events took place, in the enemy lines of his mind, where this looter's just dug in there and he just, no matter what the soldier does, he can't get him out.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so how about Ozymandias? Anything specific, any quotes?
Well, I think the idea of time being more powerful than anyone is conveyed by two key structural devices. And the first one is a frame narrative, when it says, "I met a traveller from an antique land who said," and then the rest of the poem is what the traveller said. And this traps Ozymandias' power, and it makes him seem further away, and it's more like a story.
Yeah.
So his absolute power has been reduced to just a story from someone I met, basically.
Okay.
And then the other one is the deictic marker, which is written on the pedestal. It says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And this central irony of the deictic marker, because all of his works are in the ruins, epitomizes this how different his perceived power is from reality.
Okay. That's cool. Okay. It's sort of interesting to talk a bit, well, just a tiny bit about the titles of the poems. I know Remains. Go for it. I know you have feelings about this.
There's, again, this guilt is even embedded in the title of this poem. The guilt pervades the whole poem. It's just, there's non-stop. Remains in itself is a double meaning, where in one sense it could be the physical remains of this looter on the ground after they've shot him, and then that's there in the moment, and then it could be the remains of the images in his head and the PTSD, and then obviously the images is something that stayed with the soldier forever, whereas the body gets tossed in the back of a van and driven away to be buried somewhere.
How about Ozymandias? Why just that one name as the title?
It epitomizes the arrogance and the selfishness of him, because the whole poem is about this one name, this one title, and that links to the form of the poem, which it's an iambic pentameter, which is usually used for love sonnets, so it kind of represents his love for himself, essentially.
Yeah.
But also the form of the poem changes from Petrarchan poem to Shakespearean, and then a new form which represents how all power ultimately yields to a greater force, to a greater power.
Okay. Yeah, they're obviously both very different in tone. Okay, obviously each of you prefer one poem. What is it about the tone that, forms your opinions of these poems and makes them so powerful?
I think the tone in Remains is demonstrated. There are two tones in the poem. Again, going back to the pivot of end of story, comma, except not really. At the beginning of the poem, there's almost like this sort of colloquial, more relaxed tone. For example, and one of them legs it up the road. Legs it up the road. It's not a very formal thing to say. It's very impolite. It's very colloquial. As well as there's where is it? There you go. Tosses his guts back into his body. Then he's carted off in the back of a lorry.
Yeah.
So it seems very relaxed and very sort of, it's the daily grind.
Hmm.
But even at the beginning of this physical story, there are still elements of it and little hints here and there that this is an image that's stayed with the soldier, maybe not in a good way.
Mm.
For example, myself and somebody else, using and somebody else twice, it's this ambiguous shooter. He doesn't really know who's dealt the final killing blow. There's this lack of individuality, there's these blank faces, and what that does is deters blame, suggesting from this first line of the second stanza that this is something that the soldier, he doesn't really want to be blamed for it. Like he can't take the blame along with the memories of what he's done because it might be too much for him. As well, there is he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Then there's a new stanza, pain itself, the image of agony. This structural sense, it's very emotive language as well, sort of inside out. It's this very visceral, quite brutal image.
Definitely.
And then the structural sense of it as well, with the enjambment of pain itself and how this line goes over two stanzas. It could reflect the guts of the looter spilling out onto the pavement. Like he can't control it anymore. And that could also reflect how he can't control the memories and the thoughts of this event, which in turn gives the start of the poem. It seems very relaxed, but it does have these little hints of a more sombre, sad, guilty tone, which is then really evolved in the latter half of the poem, where all he does is talk about how he just can't stop thinking about this event, which is then when it brings on an even sadder tone, which is brought to a conclusion in the final line, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Blood on his hands, or blood on someone's hands, is another way of showing guilt. So
it's quite a Shakespearean image as well, isn't it? Yeah.
I think that the tone shift throughout the poem is also what makes it really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so whereas in Ozymandias, why do you think it's more formal tone, it's formality? How does that add to the power of Ozymandias as a poem?
The formality? What do you mean, the first start of the...
Well, compared to Remains, it's very different in tone, isn't it?
Well, it's very official.
Yeah.
Could be linked to kind of a regal status in a way. But then his words are very imperative, commanding tone. But then that sharply contrasts with after, when it describes the reality of what his power has come to. It's a very bitter tone, which is emphasised by the alliteration of boundless and bare. It's sort of the plosive is almost a mocking sound.
Yeah. Okay. Any last thoughts? Any last arguments that you want to put forward in defence of your poems?
I think going back to the how guilt is sort of shown at the very beginning of the poem, but in a more subtle sense.
Sure.
At the end of the first stanza, one of them legs up the road, probably armed, possibly not. The possibly not here is this sort of niggling doubt that he just can't get rid of. He can't stop to imagine, well, if he wasn't armed, then what does that make us? What does that mean that we've done?
Yeah.
And
that's repeated later on, isn't it? That exact phrase.
So it's sort of, the repetition shows how it's stuck with him. Like he just cannot stop thinking about it. Which, I mean, all in all, it just heightens this effect of guilt and sort of sorrow and this inescapability of war and how brutal war actually is and can be and how it changes people.
Yeah, that's good.
Which I think really sort of how the poem portrays that, I think is really what makes it the best poem in the anthology.
Okay.
Well, the reason why Ozymandias is better overall is just simply because of the ideas that it's presenting. I mean, Remains is presenting effects of war, but Ozymandias is presenting ideas about power as a whole, which overarching ideas about time being powerful as well.
Okay.
It's more universal.
More universal, cross time, cross culture.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in a
Great.
sense you could say that time is as well portrayed in Remains, in the sense that the time has passed from this event and from where the writer is now, and the sort of this time has had the power to sort of manifest these images and turn them from just an event into something that's now deeply imbued in the very fabric of this person's being.
That's an interesting point, actually. Time has done sort of contrasting things in each of the poems, because in Ozymandias it's destroyed this legacy, hasn't it? It destroys,
Yeah.
whereas in Remains it's made these memories stronger.
Yeah.
So I guess that's an interesting point of comparison. But yeah, I think that was a good
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 start.
discussion, good debate.
Good first one.
Thank you very much.